Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to dive in.
Awesome. Today, we're looking at some really cool new research about how the female brain decides when to say, no thanks to potential mates.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
We've got two main sources for this deep dive. The actual research paper straight from the scientist, and then a Science News article that breaks it down, for us regular folks.
Both really interesting reads.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And get this. The research focuses specifically on active rejection, not just a lack of interest, but actual defensive behavior. So we're talking about like kicking, boxing, even running away, some pretty clear no signals. Ever wonder how the brain balances those complex behaviors like attraction and defense?
It's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
Right. Well, it turns out there's a specific brain region acting as the gatekeeper.
That's right. And what's so interesting about this research is that it's looking at active rejection, not just a passive lack of interest. We're talking about defensive behaviors, really getting the message across.
Okay, so before we get into the brain stuff, can we set the scene a bit? Like, how does female sexual receptivity work? The articles mention those no signals, kicking, boxing, even running away. It's definitely not subtle.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that in many mammals, females are only receptive to mating at very specific times in their cycle. It's all hormonally driven. And when a female is not in that fertile window, well, this research shows that there's a specific part of her brain working hard to make sure any mating attempts are unsuccessful.
That makes sense. It's not a conscious decision every time. It's more like a biological program.
Yeah.
Making sure that mating happens when it's, most likely to actually result in offspring.
Sure.
So which part of the brain are we talking about here?
It's called the ventromedial hypothalamus, or VMH for short.
The VMH, okay.
You've probably heard of it. It controls a lot of our fundamental drives and behaviors, things like hunger, thirst, but also social and sexual behaviors.
Right.
But what's really fascinating is that the VMH is evolutionarily ancient. We see it across many different species doing similar things, which really points to its crucial role in survival and reproduction.
Wow, so this isn't just some, new development in mammals. It's been around for ages.
Exactly. And scientists already knew that the VMH was involved in sexual acceptance, but what's new here is they've discovered a separate group of cells within the VMH that are specifically dedicated to rejection.
So it's like there are specialized yes and no teams all working within this one brain region.
Exactly. They call it the anterior VMH. It's like having a control center, but with two separate departments.
That's such a cool analogy. So what triggers these no neurons to, spring into action?
Well, it all comes down to progesterone. These rejection neurons are very sensitive to progesterone levels, and as you know, progesterone levels fluctuate throughout the reproductive cycle.
Right, of course.
So when progesterone is high, meaning a female is not receptive, those rejection neurons are ready to fire.
Gotcha. So then when progesterone levels drop, signaling the fertile phase, those neurons quiet down and the yes neurons can take over.
Exactly.
Okay, but how do we know for sure that these specific neurons are actually controlling this rejection behavior? Like, how did the scientists figure that out?
Well, they used a really cool technique called fiber photometry. With this technique, they can actually watch these neurons light up in real time as the mouse is interacting with a male.
Wait, they can see individual brain cells firing? That's amazing.
It is. And what they saw was in non-receptive females, those anterior VMH neurons were going crazy, flashing like fireworks. And this coincided perfectly with defensive behaviors, kicking, boxing, the whole 9 yards. But then in receptive females, those same neurons were much quieter, like they were on standby.
So it's not just a theory. They were actually seeing it happen in real time as the mouse was rejecting the male. That's incredible. But what really intrigues me is how these neurons switch between those active and quiet states. Like, what's happening at the cellular level to make that happen?
Well, to figure that out, they used a technique called electrophysiology, which basically allows them to, listen in on the conversations between neurons.
Oh, wow. Eavesdropping on brain cells.
Exactly. You see, neurons communicate with each other using electrical signals, and some of these signals are excitatory, which tell a neuron to fire, while others are inhibitory, telling it to stay quiet.
So it's like an on-off switch, but with a lot more nuance.
Yes, exactly. And what they found is that in 9 receptive females, those rejection neurons were getting bombarded with excitatory signals, like they were primed and ready to go off at the slightest provocation.
Wow.
But then in receptive females, the balance shifted towards the inhibitory signals, keeping those rejection neurons quiet.
So it's not even just about turning them on or off completely. It's more like adjusting their sensitivity. like a volume knob.
That's a great analogy.
So the brain is actually rewiring itself, changing the communication of this circuit, all based on the female's hormonal state. That's wild.
Yeah.
And get this, they even figured out how to control these neurons directly using light.
Yeah, that's optogenetics, one of the most powerful tools in neuroscience. They were able to activate the rejection neurons in females who were supposed to be receptive, you know, primed for mating, and the results were pretty amazing.
I bet. So they basically overrode the natural hormonal signals using light. What happened to the mice?
Well, these females, they instantly started showing those classic rejection behaviors. Kicking, boxing, even though their hormones were telling them to be receptive, it was like flipping a switch in their brains, really. And when they did the opposite, silencing the neurons in non-receptive females, they saw a big decrease in those defensive actions. It's pretty incredible stuff.
Wow, so they could actually trigger and suppress the behavior just by controlling those neurons with light. That's crazy. That really shows just how important these cells are. But it also kind of raises the question for me. If silencing those no neurons didn't completely flip the females into a receptive state, doesn't that mean there's more to the story? It can't just be a simple on-off switch between yes and no.
Right. You're exactly right. Rejection and acceptance, they aren't just two sides of the same coin. They're controlled by separate circuits in the brain, but they're definitely interconnected. Think of it more like two dimmer switches instead of one on-off switch. You can adjust each one independently for a lot more control, you know.
Ah, that's a great analogy. Two dimmer switches. And that makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective, right?
Yeah.
Why have one system when you can have two and get much finer control?
Exactly. Having these two separate populations of neurons, it gives the brain so much more flexibility and nuance. Even during a female's receptive phase, when those yes neurons are more active, there's still that possibility of activating the no neurons if needed.
So even when a female is, hormonally primed for mating, she still has that override button if something feels off. I can see how that would be super valuable for survival.
Absolutely. Imagine a scenario where maybe a male is being aggressive or there's danger nearby. This dual control system, it allows for these real-time adjustments to behavior, taking into account not just those internal hormone signals, but also the external environment.
Wow. It's fascinating how the brain integrates all that information to make sure the female's making the best choice for herself in that moment.
It really does highlight just how complex sexual behavior is. It's not just this simple on-off switch. There are so many layers of control and decision-making happening at both the biological and the behavioral level. And to think all of this is happening within this tiny cluster of cells in the hypothalamus makes you appreciate the incredible power in such a small space.
It really does. Reading this research, it kind of got me thinking about the implications for humans. Obviously, we know the VMH exists in humans, and we see those similar brain structures across so many species. But do we actually have any evidence that these same rejection mechanisms are at play in our own brains?
That's a great question, and it's something that researchers are actively exploring. Obviously, we can't manipulate neurons in humans the same way that we can in mice, but we can use techniques like brain imaging to see which brain areas are active in response to different social situations.
So we can't, flip those yes and no switches directly, but we can still see which areas are lighting up when someone is feeling attracted or repulsed.
Precisely. And there's growing evidence that the human hypothalamus, especially the VMH, plays a role in regulating our social and sexual behaviors, much like we see in other mammals. So while we don't have definitive proof yet, it's certainly plausible that these same rejection circuits are contributing to those complex social interactions that we have.
Yeah, think about all the different emotions, the behaviors we experience in social situations. Attraction, aversion, wanting to approach someone, wanting to avoid them. It's not hard to imagine that those ancient brain regions might be playing a role in all of that, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And if that's the case, understanding how these circuits work, well, it could have huge implications for so many things. Everything from how we form relationships to how we deal with, social rejection and aggression.
Wow, the possibilities. Imagine if we could develop therapies or interventions to help people who struggle with things like social anxiety or fear of rejection, or even just understand how these circuits might contribute to the differences we see between men and women and how they respond to stress.
Right. The possibilities are truly fascinating. This is what makes neuroscience so captivating, It's not just about understanding the brain as a biological organ. It's about understanding ourselves, our emotions, our behaviors, our very essence as social beings.
What's really cool about this research is that it reminds us that even those behaviors we might think of as instinctual, or hardwired,
Mhm.
are often much more complex and nuanced than we realize.
Absolutely. There's this whole symphony of neural activity going on, orchestrating our responses to the world around us. And it's all influenced by hormones, sensory input, past experiences, and so much more. It's like this intricate dance between nature and nurture, biology and environment, all happening inside our brains.
And it challenges us to think about our own social interactions in a new light, to consider that even some of our conscious decisions might be influenced by these ancient evolutionary mechanisms. It's kind of humbling, isn't it, to realize that we might not be as in control as we think we are.
Perhaps. But, I find it incredibly liberating, too, because by understanding these mechanisms, we can start to understand ourselves, our motivations, our behaviors on a much deeper level.
It really makes you appreciate just how adaptable the brain is.
Right.
It's not just about following some set program. It's constantly taking in new information and, making adjustments to behavior on the fly.
Absolutely. And it's amazing to think that all this complexity, it's all orchestrated within this, 3-pound organ that we carry around in our heads. It's like the most powerful computer in the known universe.
Right. Speaking of powerful computers,
Yeah.
I keep thinking back to those yes and no neurons in the VMH. And we've talked about how this research could have, implications for humans. But do you think there are any ethical considerations that we should be thinking about, as scientists learn more about manipulating these brain circuits?
That's a really, really important question. As with any kind of scientific advancement, especially when you're dealing with the brain and behavior, things get very complex very quickly. We have to be incredibly mindful of those ethical implications.
Right.
I mean, understanding how these circuits work, it could lead to incredible breakthroughs, treating conditions like social anxiety or phobias. But we have to make sure that these interventions, these treatments, are used responsibly and ethically.
It's like that old saying, right? Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. But, trying to focus on the positive here, I'm really excited to see where this research leads in the future. Imagine the potential for helping people overcome those social challenges, or even just fostering greater empathy and understanding in our interactions.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that science isn't just about, cold, hard facts. It's about understanding ourselves better and ultimately using that knowledge to make a better world.
Well said. Well, to wrap things up for today, we've learned about this really cool new research that's revealing how the female brain actually makes the decision to, accept or reject potential mates. We explored this really intricate interplay between different brain circuits, hormones, behavior. We even touched on some of the broader implications for us, as humans. As always, there's so much more to uncover, more questions to ask, but that's what makes this journey of discovery so exciting.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that we're all constantly learning, evolving, deepening our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And that is what we're all about here on the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the neuroscience of sexual rejection. Until next time.